Are you trying to chop down a high-ranking ladder opponent? Or looking to knock out your next tournament opponent? Well then, good news, because this is my guide to playing tactical support as US Forces. So the standard US Forces build order, and this can be successful with any commander. You have your starting re-echelon, then you build 3 rifleman squads. After that you tick into the lieutenant at the platoon command post, then get a 50 cal, upgrade to mechanized at the platoon command post, get your Stuart, and then go for the ambulance. 3 riflemen to start because this is the necessary amount of infantry required to contest the map. Some players go for a 2 rifle tech with the aim of getting out a fast 50 cal or 2, or perhaps a fast M20. But that is quite risky and you can easily get overwhelmed by your opponent, especially if they're playing quite aggressively, leading to massive territory losses and hurting you in the long term. Lieutenant is the favoured officer for 1v1, mainly because it gives you access to the Stuart. The Stuart dominates every Axis light vehicle short of the Puma, and light vehicle supremacy is very important for 1v1. Since you have to cover the entire map by yourself, this makes it difficult to position a single anti-tank gun to defend against your opponent's light vehicle attack, and that allows them to do massive damage with their light vehicle. And if you try to remedy this by going for double anti-tank guns at this very early stage, now you don't have enough anti-infantry to hold off your opponent. So the fact that the Stuart dominates the light vehicle arena makes it both easy to use and powerful in 1v1. Now a few of you are probably thinking the M15 anti-air half-track that the captain has is also a very powerful light vehicle, so why not go for that? First off, the controls on it are backwards, such that you have to reverse into battle, and this can be quite confusing to adapt to. It only has 320 health versus the 400 for the Stuart, and this means it dies to 2 anti-tank gun shots, which makes it a lot easier to lose. It also has a slow top speed, so if it gets into trouble out of position, it won't be able to outrun almost any enemy vehicle. It doesn't get any survivability utility in the early game, such as an activatable smoke or speed boost to help it stay alive. The main cannon has a long reload timer, and if your opponent is good, they can time their attack while that is happening, and you're almost completely defenseless. And to use attack ground, you need to activate the handbrake mode, otherwise it bugs out, and this adds an extra layer to your execution, which is quite annoying. So overall, I feel the M15 is more trouble than it's worth, at least for 1v1. However, for team games, it can make more sense. Since you are covering a smaller area of the map, it is easier to keep it defended with an anti-tank gun and rifleman snares. Panzerschrecks are more popular in team games, so the suppression increasing the reload time and massively decreasing the accuracy is very valuable. And since you can shoot down up to 4 players worth of planes, the anti-air functionality gets much more value in team games. A couple other things to note during this phase: make sure you upgrade a minesweeper on your re-echelon, ideally a couple minutes before the Stuart hits the battlefield, because nothing loses you the game faster than immediately hitting a telemine. If you're a little slow starting production on your 50 cal, while you have platoon command selected, you might as well queue up your mechanized upgrade, that way you won't forget to do it later, delaying your Stuart. And on rare occasion I will build the ambulance before the Stuart if I have quite a few low health squads, though do be aware it takes 30 seconds to construct. So ideally you would start production on it slightly before your low health squad has to retreat, so your units are not waiting back at base for healing for a very long time. For an alternative build order, you have the exact same start, 3 riflemen into the lieutenant, but from there you go to the captain, then most likely into the ambulance, though if you have enough command points, go for the M5, upgrade it with the quad mount 50 cals, and then go for whichever support weapon you need most. Against OKW I would generally suggest an anti-tank gun, and against Austria you might be able to get away with just the 50 cal if they only have one 222. This is the build that I used to defeat Quirites in the 2019 World Championships. Since with this build you plan to go for the quad and nothing that is locked behind the mechanized stage of the lieutenant or the captain, you might as well go for the double officers. This gives you a large infantry presence in the early game that can be tough for your opponent to deal with, as well as giving you the versatility of being able to access both the anti-tank gun and the machine gun, which most USF builds don't have access to. It is easier to afford this build using this commander since you have the M1919s, meaning you don't have to upgrade the weapon racks. And on top of that, the quad is quite cheap when it comes to fuel cost. Note that when you tech both officers like this, you don't need to upgrade to the mechanized stage on either of them to start your major tech. Now traditionally, these 3 riflemen into double officer builds end up bleeding you a lot of manpower as US forces in the mid to late game. However, since we are sitting back from long range using the M1919s instead of charging in with the bars, this ends up being less of an issue. And since we get both the officers early, we don't have one officer with a major vet disadvantage throughout most of the game. Do note that this build is quite weak to OKW mechanized since the quad can barely do anything against the Lux or the Puma. You can also try this variation with a rear echelon squad instead of the first rifleman. The rear echelon has a faster build time, allowing you to cap up the map in the very early stages a touch quicker, as well as costing less manpower. It also gives you twice as many opportunities to put down tank traps to provide heavy cover, which is very powerful with the M1919s. I generally would not recommend this against OKW however, since you need the firepower of the riflemen at the start of the game to force away the stern pioneers. You could also try it with just 2 riflemen into officer tech, though I personally find it difficult to play with just 2 snaring squads. Now since the M1919s are crucial in this strategy, let's take a close look at their in-game performance. Against LMG Grenadiers long range, the riflemen won 100% of the time, generally with around a third of their health remaining. Against Vet 0 Obersoldaten, the LMG riflemen won 11 out of 12 times, with around a quarter of their health remaining. However, when the Obersoldaten are at Vet 2, now they win 100% of the time, with around a third of their health remaining. If STG Volksgrenadiers try to close the distance on the M1919 riflemen, they get slaughtered. The riflemen win with around 3/4 of their health remaining. Against Jaeger light infantry out in the open, the riflemen win 100% of the time with around half their health remaining. However, repeat that engagement but with both in heavy cover, now the Jaeger lights win 100% of the time with around half their health remaining, a complete reversal. I quite often put a M1919 on my rear echelon and upgrade them with a sweeper, so against Grenadiers, the Grenadiers won 100% of the time with around a third of their health remaining. So you can see the M1919 riflemen are actually very strong, though they do have their drawbacks. The riflemen cannot fire the LMG while moving, so you lose quite a lot of the squad's moving DPS. The M1919 has worse close range performance than the regular Grand Rifles, so you also lose some close range DPS. And the M1919 has slightly worse DPS than the LMG42, in spite of costing 10 munitions more. So with this strategy, you end up using your M1919 riflemen more like you would LMG Grenadiers, attack moving them around the map, expecting them to do well in long range engagements. Quite different to the usual US Forces style, which tends to involve more run and gun, flanking attempts and aggression. I find this style easier to execute, especially in the late game, and this frees up more opportunities to micro my other units. When it comes to equipping the M1919s, I put them on my rifleman first, and then I put one on the captain. Both the captain and the lieutenant have one model that has a Thompson submachine gun, and this makes them more suited to close range fighting, so you want to utilize that during these early phases of the game. However, once these close range and flanking attempts start to dry up in the mid to late game, slap an M1919 on them on top of their bar, and that makes them decent in long range as well, making up for that Thompson. Then I tend to go for the rear echelon. It's quite nice to get some DPS on them. Vetting them up so they can get the extra model and go up to 5 man really helps with their survivability. And last of all, the lieutenants. Most of the time when I go for the lieutenant, I upgrade him with the bazooka. This means he's more engaged in vehicle fighting than anti-infantry fighting, so a low priority for the M1919. When it comes to taking weapon racks and then putting a bar on top of the M1919 with the rifleman, generally I'm not a fan of that. I prefer to spend my munitions on the commander abilities instead, or maybe even grenades. However, in 4v4, I found putting a bazooka on your M1919 rifleman more effective than you might expect. Being able to fire off a couple bazooka shots, instantly putting a Panther into engine damage range, makes them a lot easier to deal with, and the squad is still strong enough in anti-infantry. It is a very common question on my videos, how the M1919 re-echelon perform when using Volley Fire. But first, let's examine exactly how Volley Fire works. Up until the second to last major patch, Volley Fire was bugged, making it almost unusably trash. So now that it has been fixed, it is a good time to reevaluate whether you should be using it more. Volley Fire costs 20 munitions and lasts for 15 seconds. It applies a 15% received accuracy penalty to the re-echelon squad that's activating it, making it easier for the enemy to hit the re-echelon with small arms fire. This means it is generally not a good idea to activate Volley Fire when 2 or more enemy squads are shooting at the re-echelon because they end up dying too fast. It also gives the re-echelon a 50% accuracy penalty, and when you stack that on top of the bonuses squads experience when they are suppressed and pinned, this means that the re-echelon's DPS can be lackluster while Volley Fire is active. The benefit of Volley Fire is that the re-echelon can suppress the enemy squad. From 0 to 5 seconds, the re-echelon have 1% suppression, which isn't that impressive. However, the longer Volley Fire works, the better it gets. From 5 to 10 seconds, this goes up to 2% suppression and a 3% accuracy bonus. And then from 10 to 15 seconds, the re-echelon get 5% suppression, a 7% accuracy bonus, and a massive 87.5% cooldown bonus. And this means the re-echelon ends up firing very quickly during the last 5 seconds. So when using Volley Fire, ideally you would do it in circumstances where the re-echelon can fire for the entire duration of the ability, so you can benefit from the much more powerful 5 to 15 second window of Volley Fire. If you try to give a movement command to the re-echelon while they are using Volley Fire, it will instantly deactivate, and sometimes they will experience a movement speed penalty for a couple seconds after deactivation in this fashion. However, this movement speed penalty does not persist into retreat. Similarly, if you try to target a different squad while Volley Fire is active, it will deactivate instantly. And even if you try to retarget the squad you're already shooting at, it will also deactivate instantly. And be aware, if you try to use Volley Fire on a squad that you are not already shooting at, it can sometimes cause the ability to bug out, so manually attack the unit that you want to suppress with Volley Fire before activating the ability. Also note, you are unable to activate Volley Fire on team weapons, you can only use it on squads of infantry. So to test the impact of equipping a weapon on your re-echelon and then using Volley Fire, I did a lot of testing. Using a single re-echelon model against a squad of Grenadiers at both 5 and 25 range. I timed how long it took the re-echelon squad to suppress and then pin the enemy squad. Taking a look at the close range results, with no weapon the re-echelon took 11.38 seconds to suppress and were unable to pin. The M1919 took 6.6 seconds to suppress and then another 5.18 seconds on top of that to reach pinned. And finally the bar takes 5.81 seconds to suppress, but then another 6.8 seconds to reach pinned. The reason for this is that the bar does spit out more bullets, which does lead to faster suppression. However, it has to reload mid-volley fire, which slows down its progress towards pinned, whereas the M1919 does not have to reload during a volley fire cycle. And then at 25 range, the re-echelon only managed to suppress in 3 out of the 10 tests, taking an average of 13.9 seconds on those 3 occasions. The M1919 took 5.89 seconds to suppress, and then another 6.4 seconds to pin. And then the bar took 8.62 seconds to suppress and surprisingly was unable to pin. I did retest this, setting it up so the bar was continuously firing during the latter portion of Volley Fire when the suppression is at its highest, and the reload cycle would start just as Volley Fire wore off. However, even in this best case scenario, the bar was still unable to get the pin. So you can see that equipping a weapon makes Volley Fire far more effective, and the M1919 available in this commander gives you great performance at both close and long range. Now you don't have access to construct sandbags in this commander for heavy cover, though you can use rear echelon tank traps to serve this purpose, and in some ways they are actually better than sandbags. The tank trap has 480 health, which means it dies in 3 tank shots or 4 Puma shots, whereas regular sandbags only have 240 health, which means they die to 2 tank shots or 2 Puma shots. The tank traps also have 50 armor compared to sandbags which have just 35. This means that lower penetration vehicles such as the Lux and the 222 will bounce a lot more shots on the tank trap, making them a lot harder to kill. One drawback of the tank trap, however, is that it has a target size of 26 compared to just 20 for a sandbag, so this means that an enemy anti-tank gun is guaranteed to hit it even at max range, so this can make them slightly more reliable for your opponent to clear off. Tank traps are faster to construct than sandbags, taking only around 8.5 seconds, whereas Pioneers take 12 seconds to build a sandbag and mainline infantry squads take 18 seconds to build their sandbags. This gives you more time to wire off the other side, denying the heavy cover to your opponent, or even building 2 of them, which can be quite good behind the large VP flags. Only rear echelon can build tank traps, and you typically only have 1 squad of them. This can make it tough to find opportunities to plant them down in good positions, especially in the late game. And taking cover behind the tank traps can be rather awkward, with 1 or 2 models of your squad sticking out to the side. So depending on what angle you are getting attacked from, this can allow those 2 models to die rather quickly, or perhaps allow a machine gun to suppress your squad far more easily than they would if the squad was behind a sandbag instead. So since you can plant the tank trap in any orientation that you choose, which one is best for using them as heavy cover? I did extensive testing on this, covering multiple orientations as well as before and after wire. Unfortunately, I couldn't find a consistently best orientation to plant the tank trap. Here you can see 4 tank traps all facing the exact same direction, but depending where they are planted on the map, they all provide wildly different cover positions behind them. My personal preference for tank trap orientation, I place the tank trap where I want it to be and then move the cursor towards the enemy. There is also a trick to taking cover behind the tank trap. If you use the regular method of right-click dragging into cover or right-clicking close to the tank trap, most often 1 or 2 models will spread out to the side. However, if you move your cursor on top of the tank trap, now the whole squad fits neatly behind it. In some tank trap positions, if you simply move the cursor to the tank trap and right-click, the squad will run to it and not take cover in the fashion that it indicates. So move the cursor over the tank trap until the cover positions that you want are indicated, and then do a short right-click drag from there. And even with all of these tricks, the heavy cover that the tank traps provide is still not as reliable as sandbags for a 5-model squad. And if you try to fit a second squad behind the tank trap, most likely they will only get 2 or 3 cover positions, so it doesn't work very well. Now getting back to the standard build order, if you are doing poorly and you are way behind on fuel, you will need to side tick to the captain and build an anti-tank gun, perhaps even 2 of them. If you can make this call on the earlier side, that is for the best, because then the anti-tank gun can assist you against your opponent's light vehicle as well. As a twist to this build, if you manage to knock out your opponent's first medium tank relatively early on with your double anti-tank guns, you can skip the major and go straight for the Calliope, since you don't need major tech to call in the Calliope. This can actually be quite a strong option if your opponent is heavily invested into team weapons. The standard build route, if you are roughly even on fuel compared to your opponent, is Major into Jackson into Calliope. If you are having trouble with your opponent's machine guns, maybe they've gone for 2 or even 3 of them, or one is in a particularly difficult building, you can afford a mortar before going for the major. If you are badly behind, you can't really afford this mortar, you need to be spending that manpower on the captain and the anti-tank gun. And if you are doing really well, oftentimes you'll go for a second 50 cal, into the major, into a fast Sherman. And this can help you close out the game much earlier. Though be careful not to lose this initial Sherman, since you don't have easy access to an anti-tank gun to fall back on. Now let's examine the P47 Recon Run available in this commander, which is actually shockingly strong and one of the secrets to using this commander successfully in 1v1. It costs 80 munitions and lasts for 60 seconds with a cooldown of 90 seconds, so if you had enough munitions you could have it up in the air for roughly 2/3 of the game. Now some of you will know that the recon plane for Austria and Soviets only costs 60 munitions, so you might be thinking that this is a rip-off. But when you compare their performance in-game, you can see the reason why. The US Forces plane can see further, out to a range of 160 compared to just 110 for the Austria plane, and it also covers a wider angle of 120 degrees compared to just 90 for the Austria plane. So the area of sight that the US Forces plane reveals is nearly 3 times larger. And when we use the P47 Recon in the center of the 1v1 map Crossroads, you can see it reveals almost the entire map, the entire duration of the ability, so it is a very strong recon pass, and I think a lot of players underestimate how good it really is. In this commander you have the Calliope, so using the recon plane to spot excellent targets for the Calliope barrages is very strong. Quite often I will delay my Calliope barrage to the second half of the recon plane because often the enemy is vigilant when the recon plane initially hits the battlefield but gets conditioned and forgets about it towards the tail end of the ability, giving you a better chance of landing your rocket artillery. The Jackson has 60 range and the average medium tank has 40, so you can use the sight from the recon plane to exploit this 20 range advantage, allowing the Jackson to do damage and take none in return. Oftentimes as US Forces, to get sight of the enemy tank, you have to charge forwards with your riflemen, losing manpower in the process, but the recon plane avoids that completely. And on top of that you can see the position of your opponent's anti-tank guns, so your Jackson doesn't take any damage from those either. The recon plane also reveals camouflaged units, so you will spot those camouflage Raketens a mile off. If your opponent has dedicated anti-air, such as the Flak Half-Track or the Ostwind, the recon plane will get shot down before you can get much value out of it. So if you still want a brief window of vision, use the Major Recon Pass instead, since it is cheaper. And for a similar reason, in the larger team modes, where there are more likely to be OKW flag bases and just more tanks on the field with the Pintle machine gun upgrades, the recon plane also gets shot down often far too early. So this is one thing that stops this commander scaling that well into the larger team modes. Now let's take a look at the P47 Strafing Run that went through some major changes in the second to last balance patch. The ability is 90 munitions and the plane comes through for one attack pass from the direction that you indicate. As with all of these strafes, if you direct it such that the plane comes in from the closest side of the map, it will arrive significantly earlier than if you bring it in from the other side of the map, making it much harder to dodge. So you should try to do this whenever it is reasonable. Another option for targeting is to point it towards your enemy's retreat path. That way, if they try to retreat to dodge it, you can still end up doing damage. And sometimes you can end up doing more damage in this fashion, as the retreating squad ends up running further into the strafe, exposing themselves to more damage. Here I'm activating the strafe on this line of snipers to demonstrate the damage distribution of this ability. So the strafe does truly start where it's indicated from, but then it continues for 5 range beyond the indicated zone. It also seems to do more damage in the second half of the ability, enough to kill a sniper model depending on the spacing. And repeating that test, but now doing it widthways instead of lengthways, you can see the damage and the suppression skews off towards the left hand side of the ability, and it goes out quite a bit wider than the indicated zone. So this zone will be the most damaging part of the strafe. Hopefully this helps you target it more effectively. Be aware that this strafe can do friendly fire damage, and even though it is greatly reduced compared to what your enemies will take, the more annoying part is suppressing your own squad, which is often disastrous. Last on this commander's roster is the Calliope, and this is one of the best pieces of rocket artillery in the game. It costs 380 manpower and 115 fuel, and as mentioned earlier, you do not need to tick the major to be able to call it in. The key to using the Calliope successfully is to drive it as close to the enemy as you feel comfortable before doing the barrage. This helps in two ways. It lowers the time between the Calliope making loud rocket launching noises that your opponent can hear, and the rockets landing on the target, giving your opponent less time to dodge. It also tightens up the scatter of the rockets, increasing the chance of multiple rockets hitting the enemy before they can dodge away, which typically results in more squad wipes. Comparing the craters left behind after the maximum and minimum barrages, you can really see the difference in scatter. Also, pay close attention to the minimum range scatter pattern. The rockets tend to scatter short and long, but don't go very wide. This means that for close range barrages, when the enemy's retreat path or movement path is perpendicular to the Calliope, these tend not to be as successful for wiping the enemy since they don't have to travel as far to clear the scatter zone. Thus, less rockets end up connecting with them before they make it to safety. Now you're probably thinking getting in close before barraging is the key to success with most rocket artillery pieces, so what makes the Calliope so special? It has 320 health, which means that most tanks require 2 shots to kill it. It also has 110 armor, which makes lower caliber guns far less effective against it, and this means you are less likely to lose it when you drive it to the front lines for a barrage. It has a minimum barrage range of 40, so you can drive it in quite close, minimizing the rocket's travel time and thus minimizing your opponent's reaction window. Timing the gap between the audio cue of the rockets launching and the first rocket landing, the Calliope is the fastest of all rocket artillery pieces, taking just over 1.5 seconds. Note that all of this testing done at 50 range for more participation and more relatable to in-game performance, since driving closer than 50 range is extremely risky. When firing most indirect fire pieces into the fog of war, you get 25% more scatter. In this example, the Calliope with vision ends up wiping the heavy machine gun around 1.5 seconds faster than the one firing into the fog of war. And if you look at the craters left behind after these barrages, you can definitely see the impact of that increased scatter firing into the fog of war. So if you're looking for precision wipes, you definitely want vision of your target, and that's where the Calliope synergizes so well with the recon plane in this commander. If you don't have enough munitions for the recon plane, at Vet 1 the Major's sight range goes from 35 to 50, making it a great spotting tool. And this way you don't have the audio cue of the recon plane giving away to your opponent that you are readying for a Calliope barrage, making this tougher to dodge. The Calliope only does half damage to units behind heavy cover, whereas some other rocket artillery pieces do full damage to units behind heavy cover. So although the unit is more clumped up in the heavy cover, and typically more clumped up during their retreat as well exiting the heavy cover, potentially making them more susceptible to getting wiped, because of the damage reduction it tends to make it not that good to target with the Calliope. Rather uniquely, at Vet 3 Grenadiers get a 20% received damage bonus. This makes them less susceptible to getting wiped by explosives. So in the late game I prefer to target the support weapons of Osthea with the Calliope instead of the Grenadiers, because between the received damage bonus on the Grenadiers and the support weapons having to take time to pack up before retreat, this tends to lead to far more wipes and perhaps even weapon steals. And in the ultra late stages of the game, it's about adapting your build to counter what your opponent is doing. If you need more anti-tank, build another Jackson or another anti-tank gun. If you're trying to hold on to the victory points for the win, build another 50 cal. If you need more anti-infantry, build a Sherman and use the high explosive rounds. Generally in 1v1 you can't afford more than one Calliope because of the high population cost, and this would leave you exposed to their vehicle play, especially because you don't have proper mines to defend your Calliopes from a vehicle dive. I feel you need at least 2 riflemen in the late game for snaring potential, so if you drop down below this number I would suggest rebuilding them. So now you know how to play tactical support like an expert. It offers less offensive potential in the early game, but offers a much more well-rounded late game that is easier to execute and suited to dealing with the team weapon heavy play that is common at the higher ranks. Enjoy! That's it guys, and if you enjoyed this guide, I hope you consider coming on board as a Patreon backer since these take a tremendous amount of time to produce.